Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from the world. Today we have a very timely webinar, unpacking the rising threat of surface-to-air missiles and drones to civil aviation. We're fortunate to be joined by three of the region's preeminent experts in this field, Jim Termini, John Jenkins, and Spencer Wakelam. Jim is Southpack Aerospace's Principal Advisor for Aviation Security. His experience in commercial aviation spans over 20 years, having co-founded one of the world's leading aviation security companies, Redline, in the UK. He's also a permanent observer to the ICAO Working Group on Guidance Material. John Jenkins is an aviation program manager and defence consultant with 30 years experience in military and civil aviation, specialising in UAS operations, airworthiness and aviation safety management. John has led complex military operations and flew Tornado fighters in the RAF as a weapons and electronic warfare instructor. We also have Spencer, who's a senior security risks consultant with Security Consulting Group and coordinates the SCG transport market in Queensland. His career has spanned military intelligence, law enforcement, and security risk management, having led and delivered more than a dozen security projects with major airports across Australia. So today's session has been in planning for several months. However, given the events that have unfolded this week, this session couldn't be more timely. So over to the panel to open up the webinar.
Hi, thanks, Katie. Thanks for the introduction. It's very good of you. I'm Jim. I'll be taking us or walking us really through the international and national regulatory and policy frameworks that are in place. But before we do, I would just like to reiterate that as a panel, we're coming at this from the perspectives of security. So obviously, particularly with a drone, UAV or UAS, and we'll explain the differences to those acronyms later on, there are significant concerns both from a safety and a security side, as we've seen. So just to reiterate, we're looking at this really from the point of view of security. Additionally, if anybody does have any questions, we've reserved a block of time towards the end of the webinar where we would like to reserve and wait for any questions at that point. And feel free to put questions through the website. Katie will be collating those and curating them for us at the end. And if you want to as well, you can address either one of us with specific questions, or if it's just a general question, we will attempt it from each of our points of view of expertise. So without wasting too much more time, let's have a look at some of the regulatory, legal and policy frameworks that are in place from the security point of view. So for both MANPADs and UAVs, and I should just add as well that from this point forward, we will only use the term UAV just so that we don't cause any confusion and for standardization. From the international perspective, we are clearly governed by Annex 17, which has its SARPs, the standards and recommended practices. Standard 4.3.6, as you can see here, highlights that states shall ensure that appropriate measures on both the ground and operational procedures are established to mitigate possible attacks against aircraft using MANPADs and other weapons representing a similar threat at or near an airport. So in preparing for this webinar, we've taken that last sentence really to its logical degree, in that we will talk about UAVs with relevance to standard 4.36. And we'll also touch on other standoff weapons such as rocket-propelled grenades and mortars as well. There is a lot more guidance in document 8973, and for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's the ICAO Aviation Security Manual, and there's a full chapter dedicated to the protection of civil aviation infrastructure against unmanned aircraft. That's chapter 19. And then Appendix 27 to the same document has got a lot of detailed information about surface-to-air missiles. And we've just added the caveat there that any plausible scenario, not scenario, so any plausible scenario should be fully risk assessed. That's in line with other ICAO standards that require risk assessments. Coming down a level then from the international to the national perspective for frameworks and guidance. So we talk about national legal measures used to mitigate attacks. Every country is different. I know that in my experience out in some of the South Pacific islands, the New Zealand Civil Aviation Rule Part 102 is being examined for applicability in some of the island states where it's a very different threat environment. So these 6 bullets here really are just sort of big hand, small map type guidance material. So in terms of airspace restriction, defining no fly in restricted zones is a good idea. And the reason that exemption zones or exclusion zones are a good idea is it means that if something is flying, then we know it shouldn't be. And if there is something flying without a license, then we should be able to do something about it, which is the critical aspect. From the safety point of view, registration and operator licensing ensures accountabilities of UAVs. And in real terms, that means that UAV pilots will understand that they should not be flying in or around an airport and within the exclusion zone. And again, from the security perspective, that just reinforces the point that if there is a drone active in our airspace, then it shouldn't be. Remote ID, so remote identification and/or tracking, enables authorities to detect and identify drones in restricted airspace. That is obviously fully dependent on the relevant equipment being installed on the ground. Some useful operational limits that can be enforced in these mitigation measures, altitude caps, ensuring that the drone or UAV pilots have got a visual line of sight, and safe distances to prevent the UAV itself from approaching runways or aircraft. In terms of authority, aviation security ideally, but definitely the police and/or the military need legal powers to detect, disrupt, or neutralize any drones that might be impacting on aircraft operations. Now, obviously, we've just had the major incident at Copenhagen Airport. There are further reports coming out of Oslo. Whether they are linked incidents or not is yet to be determined from what I've seen. But in both instances, the control authorities will always require legal authority to intercept and do something about these things. And then finally, penalties enforcement, having appropriate offences and sanctions against illegal UAV operations provide a deterrent. Everything that we've just spoken about rather rapidly there will require a significant level of cross-sector coordination. So the guidance that we brought together on this particular aspect is having a national coordination body, a formal meeting that links aviation security, aviation regulators with police, military, any form of intelligence or information gathering, and of course the the emergency management. So fire response, RFF crews, and anybody else that might be involved in the detection or the disruption of UAVs. Information sharing networks. So out in the islands, again, I know that intelligence and information is quite difficult to get hold of. But having some form of viable intelligence that operates between civil aviation authorities and the control agencies is clearly a critical thing. Joint risk assessments and contingency plans that uses shared threat assessments, harmonized response plans, and is then culminated through joint exercises, preferably at the airport. Defined roles and authorities, so clear legal authority for who's responsible for the detection, who disrupts any form of illegal activity, who prosecutes, so that there's really very little overlap or gaps between the agencies. So it should be a single operation, but with clearly defined roles and authorities. Crisis communication protocols, having lines for rapid alerts to airlines, the airports, and first responders during a UAV or MANPADs incident. Remember that these are standoff weapons. They can be launched from anywhere. And the guys will be talking about potential launch areas later on. But it's not necessarily going to be, and probably isn't going to be, within the airport estate itself. So in short, bringing all of the sectors together, sharing intelligence and information, clarifying roles, planning jointly, and rehearsing your individual responses should help all involved. And for a little bit more information now about the MANPADs, I'm going to hand over to John Jenkins.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just going to cover off some very basic information really about the MANPADs, because whilst they are simple systems, they obviously the theory behind them can be quite complex. And having been on the bitter end of experience of these things, the probability of kill that goes with them is greatly reduced compared to radar laid. So generally speaking, these are infrared. So the biggest thing with the MANPADs, man-portable air defense systems, is they're the classic tube that can sit on the shoulder and be launched, and still a fairly simple operation. But to get that probability of kill, of a successful outcome for the person firing it, is obviously another thing again, and takes practice. So shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles, aiming at targets. It says they're low altitude, as you can see from the slide below that. They can go up to anywhere, potentially even up to 20,000 feet for the modern systems. But as you go from ground level to, say, 15 to 20,000 feet, the chances of it actually getting the outcome that the person desires greatly reduces. And the same goes for the range. So close in range versus longer range, again, reduces the chances of that kill. So they can go out to even further than 6Ks, 7, 8Ks, but again, the probabilities start dropping off. Mostly, as we've already discussed, infrared homing, so the very basic ones, the early first generation, so the kind of stuff that was in these late 60s, so SA-7s from Russia. You have the FIM-43s, I think it is, the red eye from the US and Vietnam. Much of those systems are spread across the world in various factions. Generally speaking, they're the simple system. They lock onto the engine or the heat source, and then they try and track down the heat source itself. And then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the advancements on that. But generally speaking, as we move into the later generations, they can actually be imaging infrared or even into the UV spectrum to get a little bit more discernible capability against targeting. Lightweight, so they can be moved around, and that's the key effort. The key point in terms of civilian airspace and civilian airport realms, is that these things can be moved around relatively easily in comparison to obviously a radar laid, and a radar laid system is obviously laborious to get it into place, and obviously not very extremely conspicuous. The biggest thing is, and I'll show you a map in a second, but the availability from the 60s onwards is huge. So these things have been circulating globally in multiple conflicts. Afghanistan, Libya was a big source in recent times. So 2011, with the stocks there being plummeted, basically raided by the various factions and forces and then distributed around the Middle East. Syria is another obvious one. Ukraine and Russia is another one. Afghanistan was one of the first ones, with the Americans firstly supplying into there, and then the Russians themselves. Slide, please. Just a quick video then on the effects. So this is some footage from a firing from the vicinity of Baghdad onto a commercial airliner that's operating. Again, there's pictures there of the American systems, but again, demonstrating the shoulder launch, relatively short range, and the capability can be catastrophic. Those guys were fairly lucky in the DHL that they actually affected the hydraulics, was the prime thing, didn't actually hit the engine itself, which suggests that it was more one of the more earlier first-gen systems. Again, the ability to see or understand that this system is in place is difficult, unlike a radar-laid surface-to-air missile system. So The only counter you've got against it is the Mark 1 eyeball of visually seeing these things. And the biggest thing, and I think the biggest message about this, is if any of these systems are coming into your sphere of operations, you should already know about them through the state-sponsored intelligence and the various government agencies that should be monitoring these groups. They're not that easy to come by, despite what we say. This map is pretty much giving you an overview of the hotspots. So MENA, so Middle East, North Africa is one of the prime hotspots. The Sudan recently, Yemen, key areas. Obviously, the downfall in Syria has opened up the availability there, and obviously the sources of China and Russia feeding into the various conflict zones is a proliferation. You can see down in the Australasia and the Eastern Pacific, in the Pacific area, the proliferation is not as huge, but the availability is still that is a possibility in that particular area. So lots of numbers, and there are a few instances involved in this. Slide, please. So just quick coverage then, as they go through the bullet points, then we can see some of the hotspots on an airliner. So for the first gen, we'll be looking for things like the engine exhaust. So obviously the high bypass engine is a factor. The engine intake, bizarrely enough, is not, despite what you see there on the picture, if the throttles are brought back, that cools down very quickly compared to the exhaust. Heated windscreens can be a factor. However, not generally speaking the biggest heat source. And then obviously you've got other areas like the avionics cooling bay, etc. But to get a successful kill and a high probability of kill, you're almost certainly going to the exhaust areas of the engines rather than the leading edges. And I'll come on to that now, onto the next slide. Slide, please. So what does this diagram basically tell you? The aircraft you see approaching the zone to the right. So if you imagine the red triangle is the launch area. So as you've got a closure rate of the speed of the aircraft and the missile velocity, the extensive range that the missile can actually be effective in is actually larger than if the aircraft is flying away from the MANPAD. The probability of kill in that area, whilst it's a larger area, is lower because the heat signature isn't as much. And the reaction of the seeker and the missile itself needs to be higher to be able to cope with the turns, noting the closure of the velocities between the two systems. As on the left-hand side of the slide there, as it departs from the MANPAD area, you can see climbing out that the zone is smaller, but it's also a more effective zone, so a higher probability of kill. And the reason for that is if the missile's in a tail chase onto a fairly fast-moving aircraft, it's going to be struggling, and any maneuver by the aircraft is going to cause it to run out of energy fairly quickly. And that's another key element of this, that these systems run out of energy. So when we talk about max range, max altitude, the probability of kill drops off because the energy that's afforded to the system to be able to react to any maneuvering drops off rapidly, and the same for any kind of heat-seeking signatures. Slide, please. So vulnerabilities then, I've alluded to it already. You can see that image in the top right, that's the DHL aircraft Baghdad, I believe. So you can see the impact was not quite on the engine, but close to it. So some of these systems, when we start getting into the second generation, they've got cooling to the seekers, so they get a better signature from the infrared seeker. If you go to the third generation, they're actually seeing an image of the picture that you just saw. So they're actually looking at the shape of an aircraft. So if you're trying to use things like flares as countermeasures to try and distract them, then first generation, that works very well, certainly in the military sense. Second generation for cool seeking, it makes it more difficult. Third generation, they're looking at the picture of the aircraft, not just a blind flare of an image like you can see on that top right there of an infrared output. So the aircraft, generally speaking, take off and landing as your main vulnerability from the range and the altitude. On the final approach, the heat signature is less. On departure, the heat signature is greater, but you also saw that the energy of the missile varies in that. Predictable routes, that's the problem, biggest problem. In the military sense, you're varying your routes. For the civilian airline process, then obviously predicting the flight paths in and out of an airport is extremely easy, especially when you've got Flight Radar 24, etc., as those tools and assets. High value targets, well, that's the key part of this. I mean, we can fly drones around and bring an airport down, but ultimately if an organization that's got a nefarious intent they're going to want the headlines, and bringing down an airline as a high value target will give the mass casualties, economic disruption, it says there, and the biggest thing, shock and media attention. Can we defend against it? Pretty much it is difficult, it's expensive, and much of the technology sits in the military domain. And to be successful to employ it, you also need the intelligence and the technology to keep it upgraded and maintained. As you can see there, rare exceptions there, LL. So pretty much there's about 3 Israeli airlines that have systems that can counter this fairly effectively. They're expensive, they've got penalties, drag, weight, increased fuel loads, etc. Obviously, for certain customers, absolutely essential. Slide, please. What's the realized risk? Well, the chances of somebody actually getting a hit in the first generation, generally speaking, the seeker is aiming to hit the aircraft. In the second generation, third generation, they've got proximity fusing, so they have more chance of success. So you can see in some of those early occasions there, Sri Lanka for the Lion Air, shot down, 55 killed, obviously very fortunate smaller aircraft, the Antonov 24. 2002 Mombasa, 2 missiles fired, both missed. Probably very early generation missiles, missile systems, MANPADs. 2003 DHL, as you saw, they got a hit, didn't quite hit the heat source, suggesting you're probably into your still first gen, maybe second gen. 2007, the Ilyushin 76, fairly large cargo plane. They're also the early warning aircraft that you saw, possibly saw in Russia, that the Ukrainians hit on the ground with the big domes on them. So a significant aircraft shot down, 11 killed Mogadishu. Probably the key part of that, if you look along that list, you can see they're in those areas of volatility and possibly proliferation, free movement of those MANPADs. Unlikely in more of the Western kind of style, popular airports, etc. And again, I stress that the intelligence should be driving the capability to try and combat this long before they get into the position. The stats you can see at the bottom there, that's from the DFAT paper. So actually surprising how many of these incidents and occurrences have occurred. Again, if you map that out to the countries and the likelihood, then you can see that there's a lot of misses as well. There are some crashes, but again, it's saying propeller-driven aircraft. Pretty much how much of those are small aircraft that are involved in, the incidents or the combat that's going on in that country at the time is difficult to tell. Slide, please. What can we do about it? Well, we can have onboard defenses, but pretty much the defensive aid suites are military. If you put them on commercial airliners, there's a massive overhead, not just buying the system and put it on and then the field penalties, but then the upkeep and sustainment and then intelligence required to keep the algorithms in those systems up to speed and effective. Examples we've got is Elbit, which is an Israeli system, and C Music. The most latest one is J Music, which is upgraded even further. That is quite useful. So that's a Durham-Moores type system. So missile approach warning systems, what do? Well, they're either got laser detection, so they're picking up movement and systems coming in, or it may be a directed infrared system, or it can even be in the UV space. But either way, they're actually picking up the inbound missile, because don't forget, there's no radar warning of this stuff, purely the visual pickup of a missile inbound. What can it do? It can use what's called DIRCM, directed infrared countermeasures. So you're actually directing your countermeasures against the missile system to try and target it and counter those upgraded algorithms in the new, more modern systems. So you're trying to blind or deflect the seeker, so it's going to a false target and not directly at the aircraft itself. These are advanced systems. They're generally speaking on military systems. There's the LAIRCM, which is on the C-17. There's multiple things on the C-130. The Russians have got similar stuff. Chinese have got very similar things. Very rarely they are on civil airlines. To give you an idea, it costs somewhere in the $1 to $3 million just for a piece of equipment, let alone the sustainment and the maintenance of it. So crucially, it does not use full flares, so it can be use of flares in civilian airspace can be problematic because there is a residue from it. Slide, please. Here's an example of what it looks like. So $1 to $3 million, fair old bit of chunk of metal for the defensive aid suites on the bottom of an airliner. It's got the Moore system and then the directed energy for the infrared to try and combat the incoming IR missile. Still effective even towards the third generation imaging infrared systems. Slide, please. Talked about the envelope that you can see from MANPADs, and we're looking at this now. Spencer's going to talk about the PLAs, so risk assessed areas of possibilities. Looking at that map, you can see there are possible positions that would be on high ground, flat terrain on the departure path, side aspects. The reason we've chose PLA 001 is because it gives you that initial envelope of the aircraft coming towards you. So you've got that bigger envelope, closure rates are higher, you've got more range with the missile system. And as the aircraft turns to the rear aspect, as it departs over the ocean there, you've then got that other part of the envelope. So that is one of the more likely positions for the a MANPAD to be more effective, mainly because you've got the arrival and the departure aspects to give you a higher chance of kill. Slide, please. So airport threat levels, perimeters and access, unauthorized entry, there's hiding stuff in culverts, surface roads. So areas around, it's a large area to cover, lots of opportunities for people. So again, I stress state and intelligence and law enforcement agencies really need to be giving you the information ahead of time that there's a threat out there. And then you're looking at your perimeter access. Potential launch areas I've just covered off, but again, they would ideally have quick access to the roads. High ground is an obvious one to give you best aspect. Clutter causes a problem. And what do I mean by clutter? Trees in the way are going to cause issues with the infrared seekers trying to get a lock. A lot of these systems, you're trying to get a signal and a lock before you launch. You're not just launching and hoping it's going to hit the aircraft system. So you're trying to get a solution to your weapon before it's launched. For UAVs, a very different case. So UAV incursions, as Jim's already alluded to, they can be launched from anywhere. The proliferation of them is huge. You can buy them in any town and in any state. The violations themselves, the disruptions of runways can cause problems. They can also be used for surveillance to set up ready for something bigger. And obviously they also have now kinetic or weapons events that are associated with them, as we've seen in Ukraine. So again, these are the kind of problems that we've got. Insider facilitation, again, always an issue in all sorts of security aspects on any kind of operation of a civilian airport facility. Public vantage points, roadsides, car parks, open land, again, they're going to be going more covert, so probably not doing that. But bear in mind with a MANPAD or a UAV, they can launch it quickly and they can escape quickly. It's fire and forget and they can be gone. So there's a lot of things to consider when you're looking at your risk assessments for these kind of systems. And your intelligence of understanding how these systems work will lead you to that plan of action to try and combat it as best you can. Slide, please. Handing over to Spence.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, you've led me in nicely with your reference to your risk assessments there. So I think most of the people, if not all, who are listening into the webinar today are in a civil aviation space. And we'll deal with airlines, air carriers, and it's vital that you each appreciate that you are all in a different risk context. Wherever you are, we operate in Australia, and Australia is a huge country, and there's a different risk context between the major international airports within Australia. So if you're in a different part of the world, then you need to be aware of your own particular risk context. And how do you do that? Well, John did allude to it with his mention of your making the use of your intelligence that is available to you. So I'm going to diverse a little bit away from the content of this slide, but I just want to, before we go on, just emphasize how important it is for you to be aware of the genuine risk and the genuine threat to your assets, as whether you're an airport operator or an airline operator. The best way to establish what your risk context is to be aware of your threats, whether they have the intent and capability, and what the level of their intent and capability is to actually mount an attack, be it with a MANPAD, or to use a UAV in a malicious or a curious or just a mischievous way. So if you are aware of the capability and intent of the threats in your risk context, then you can start to build a picture as to the likelihood of something happening. Now, as you saw from the map earlier on the earlier slide, in Australasia, there's no indicated MANPAD threat at the moment. Most of that is, as John said, in MENA, Northern Europe, and Africa, and some Southern American countries, or Central America, should I say. So, first of all, know what your threat and know what your risk is. So you're not overly concentrating on threats and risks that are very low in your environment. So that's a sort of a qualifier, really, to say before you start taking serious countermeasures, know what your risk environment is. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Jim? So there are defense measures that you can take against. I mean, on this slide it says MANPADs, but really it applies to MANPADs and UAVs. So if you have established in your threat environment that you operate in that there might be an existent threat, then you can start to apply intelligence holdings to analyze the area around your asset, be it an airfield, an airport, or an HLS, or a helicopter landing site, that kind of thing. So you can start to apply what I would use. It's an old military technique, intelligence preparation of the territory. It used to be called intelligence preparation of the battlefield. So you can start to look at the areas around your site and start to identify potential launch areas, and you can add those potential launch areas to your routine security patrols so that they can present a visible presence of guardianship to deter that kind of activity happening in the first place, or detect it if it's being set up and respond to it. Think about line of sight mapping and as well as potential launch areas, because as John and Jim both said, that UAVs and MANPADs can be used in a standoff, not direct line of sight, or we say beyond visual line of sight way. So start to think about where, if you were one of these threat actors, you would position yourself, and it gives you an idea of where to focus your attentions. And once you've done that, form good relationships with your local law enforcement, any other security agency that might be relevant, your civil aviation regulators, and your airline operators, your AIPs. So in particular, I want to talk about the regulation, because from a point of view of UAVs, first of all, because they are so easily obtained, the proliferation of them is huge, as John said. They can be bought commercially off the shelf or manufactured very, very easily from easily obtainable or manufactured, printed, 3D printed components. That is why your local or your regional civil aviation authority should have measures in place to strictly regulate the use of them. So, for instance, here in Australia, CASA bans the flight of any UAV that's over 250 grams from within 5.5 kilometers of a controlled airport. And a controlled airport, that's an airport with a control tower. And UAVs that are less than 250 grams, they're permitted within 5.5 kilometers of an airport, but can't fly any higher than 45 meters, and are not allowed anywhere near an approach path or a departure path, or indeed within an airport boundary. So, as Jim said at the beginning of this webinar, straight away you can tell if there is a flight within those parameters, then you know that it shouldn't be there in the first place. There are different reasons why people would want to fly a UAV within proximity of an airfield or an airport. Most of them not malicious. Usually it's out of ignorance or curiosity, or just mischief. But we do have to consider things like wanting to deliberately use a gravitational, or dropping an item from a drone. So one of the key things that we look at when we're dealing with aviation security is that sacrosanct boundary between airside and landside, and keeping passengers that have already gone through security screening away from non-security screened people, so that no contraband can be passed. So that's one of the reasons potentially why somebody would want to fly a UAV over an airfield perimeter. Do you want to move on, Jim? You're on mute, Jim.
Jim, you're on, just confirm you're on mute. I'll cover this one if you like.
Yeah, there you go. It had to be someone. It was going to be me. So I just wanted to talk quickly about the threat from UAVs, and I'll bring John in as necessary, really. But when we're talking about UAVs, we're talking about a range of flying machines that are, like Spence said, less than 250 grams, but still have some payload capability or surveillance capability, up to the military style drones that we're seeing operating around airports around Europe, and most especially Ukraine and Russia. So there's a massive range of threats just from UAVs alone. And when we consider that they're around about the $3,500 mark, and they're deliverable anywhere, normally by an express package operator. So ironically, they'll get flown to you. Very, very easy to buy off the shelf. And as Spence said, the development in 3D printing now means that they don't actually need to buy anything. The plans are out there on the internet. UAVs can be made with a relatively cheap 3D printer. They have a substantial payload, often a lot heavier than the UAV itself. The range and endurance, I mean, the details that you're seeing on the screen now are from a Chinese manufactured, commercially available hobby drone. And even now we're talking about 2 to 10 kilometers away with modified first person view machines that are 20 to 40 kilometers. And the larger systems, the octocopters that they make movies with are even further. And then when we talk about autonomy with AI-based flight planning and GPS waypoint navigation, it gets even more frightening. So at that point, Jenks, if you want to come off mute, and anything you want to add to the general threat overview from UAVs?
Yeah, the only addition is to reiterate on that table on the right-hand side, that's the lower end of the scale. I've seen recently in the consultancy I'm doing now, 25 kilograms out to 25 kilometers, it'll go up to 10,000 feet, and it costs probably twice that price, and it's capable of carrying cargo. That was all done. In terms of power, you can see on the top right picture there, those motors themselves can be rated far in excess of the weight of the vehicle itself, so the cargo it can carry is significant, extremely significant. We're talking the size of a civilian airline passenger suitcase, 25 kilograms. Without any problems at all, with some serious motors on board. And then the capabilities online are huge of components and 3D printing. It took them about 4 days to produce this UAV that would actually carry up to 22 kilos. Just a quick one, drones versus UAVs versus UAS. It's terminology. Drones covers everything, land, sea, and air. It's more less autonomous systems. UAVs are the uncrewed air vehicles, as they call them these days. The UAS is the whole system, the ground control system, the air vehicle itself, and any other supporting systems that go with it. You may see in the UK, certainly, they use RPA, remotely piloted aircraft, just because that brings the human into the loop. for that element of control, certainly when dealing with civil airspace. UAVs, universal. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, thanks. So why are we so vulnerable to these things? Well, there's a lot of overlap in the airspace, especially around low altitude zones, which are clearly the maneuvering areas for commercial aircraft. And typically the smaller UAVs will operate in those same zones, which is another reason for significant geo-fenced and exclusion areas around commercial airfields. They are very hard to detect. They're very small. So the radar signature is next to nothing unless you're using specific systems like millimetric wave radar. But even then, these things will blend into the background clutter of trees, buildings, and anything else that's around there. They cause mass disruption without a direct strike, as we've seen, and we'll cover that in a couple of slides. We'll just have a very quick chat about Copenhagen and Oslo. And as everybody in the panel has said, these modified drones can deliver explosives, contraband, or conduct reconnaissance. So where we're talking about contraband, that was the point that Spence was making, in that, as with prisons, these things can hop over a high wall and just make a delivery very, very accurately in the middle of the night, no lights, and just leave something. So in terms of the sterile area, it means that when airports are doing their sterile area searches, there's another aspect in that if somewhere is wide open and available for a potential UAV landing, then they should be searched accordingly. So some realized risks. 2018 in Gatwick, we saw this multiple UAV sightings shut down the airport for about 36 hours. And I'll just zoom to the end of that where it says estimated losses in excess of 50 million. And that was protesters. So job done. Heathrow and Dubai, 2019. I could have included Abu Dhabi in that, but it was a little bit different. But again, short-term closures due to drone sightings. And then the big one is obviously the massive generation in technology that Ukraine is going through in particular at the moment. And I know that the Ukrainians and the Russians are leapfrogging each other in drone technology. But the picture here you see is of the airport attack on that Operation Spider's Web. So what you see is there was a surveillance aircraft was launched. It just sat there guiding the others. Then they were attacked by payload carrying UAVs. Now what we see there is a line of aircraft, and just because they've got military markings on, they could easily have been commercial aircraft sitting at a major airport anywhere in the world, just flying around and really just crashing in and destroying aircraft at will. And then, of course, the day before yesterday. So we don't know anything more than anybody else. All we have is open source information. And we don't know very much. We don't know who perpetrated the attack. I think we can all take a pretty good guess as to who it was and to what the reasons were. The main thing to take away from this attack really is the disruption it caused at Copenhagen in particular from 2 or 3 large drones. So we know that that's reasonably accurate. We've got the size of the drones or UAVs reported from multiple sources now. So large would indicate that this wasn't just a bog standard protest. They could well have been carrying something. It could have been a dry run just to see, or it could have just been a nuisance attack. We just really do not know yet. 15 flights diverted to other airports, but probably the biggest takeaway for whoever did perpetrate this attack was what the responses were from the Danish police and Danish aviation security. So my personal opinion is it was probably a dry run as a nuisance. Let's see what happens when we do this. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it ties into other airspace infringements that are going on in that region at the moment anyway. Jenks or Spence, do you want to add anything to the Copenhagen?
No, I think the only thing is that you could easily have flown those things into aircraft. You don't need anything sophisticated, just simply the drone to the aircraft.
Yeah, yeah.
Sufficient. Probability of kill low, however, the outcome's catastrophic.
Yeah. So in terms of the threat overview, the threat from various sources is we tend to put it into bands. So I can talk about it from my point of view when the threat to the aircraft I was flying was heavy machine guns. So we had this threat band of 0 to 6,500 feet, which is really based on the tracer ignition point and the tracer burnout point of heavy caliber machine guns. But in terms of your own planning, these are the sorts of blocks of airspace that you're going to need to consider defending. So I'll ask Jenks there to jump in with anything he wants to add to this slide.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'd reiterate that as soon as you start going up in altitudes of feet, your chances of achieving a target hit, probability to kill, becomes a lot less. In the UAV space, there's a lot of novel use of UAVs in weaponizing them in various forms, not just carrying explosives, but also using them as hit-alls themselves. The altitude is very much dependent on the camera system and guidance system for these things. So you may have seen a slide there with some terminology of FPV, which is first person view. So that means effectively wearing VR goggles or having a display. So effectively you're flying it as if you sat in the UAV itself as a cockpit. And therefore you can guide it a lot more accurately to the location as required, which means that that altitude is literally just a number. It's down to the capability of the FPV and the operator to be able to go higher. So that in theory, they could go up to 5, 7.5. These things with the motors on board, highly rated, gives them the altitude. So the data link, the communication link between the ground and the system itself is the key, and that has a power rating. So again, with technology advances, that's becoming, the envelope is becoming a lot bigger. So the proliferation and the development is huge.
Thanks, mate. We're going to hand over to Spence now for a trot through general mitigation points.
Yeah, so there are a lot of countermeasures which my fellow panelists have already alluded to. Technological countermeasures, radio frequency, but I think I want to stress the importance of certainly from a UAV point of view, the regulation first, because by a huge margin, the overwhelming majority of UAV traffic it is people who don't generally intend to bring down an aircraft. They are just there, they're causing a nuisance. They may want to disrupt operations, as we saw in Copenhagen or at Gatwick and Heathrow, or they may not realize that is indeed what they're doing. So, you know, here in Australia, we're developing the National Drone Detection System, which involves uncrewed traffic management and the development of flight information management systems, so that being able to track individual UAV aircraft within certain zones, it gives you that first layer of defense. If you try and rely on a single method, such as some of the stuff that we're seeing on the slide here, it's a single point of failure when it comes to your mitigation strategy. You need to have layers of defense, starting off with your local authorities' regulation of the flights of UAVs. Secondly, you need your people to be aware and vigilant, because I'm disappointed that John beat me to the phrase "Mark One eyeball" earlier on. But that is something that sticks with us. Anybody that's been in the British military it's the most important detection device. As well as ears as well. So the vigilance of your people is also key. The number of times that people will spot a drone flying before it's been detected technically or has even been heard is remarkable. So think of the layers of protection in your mitigation strategy before you start to try and apply a technical measure. If the first layers aren't enough, then start to look at some of these technical measures. I think on the next slide, Jim, I think we've got some more measures, have we? Or that's the mitigation plan. Let's talk about that. Okay, you need to come off mute again, Jim.
I know. In terms of MANPADs and UAV mitigation planning, I'm not going to go through each one of these in any great depth because should be self-explanatory. But in terms of a mitigation plan, which is a requirement by ICAO for a state to have, and then a lot of states require their international airports to have their own MANPAD and UAV mitigation plan. These are the sorts of areas that certainly states need to be looking at. The governance and the roles, so who owns, what the steering groups are, and what the decision matrices are. Prevention is always better than anything else. Hardening, so line of sight out to 0 to 5Ks with an approach map. Perimeter fixes, what the environment is. So basically we're talking about getting rid of PLAs in the first place. And then if we're still going to find them, what we're going to do about them. Procedurally, the detect, decide, and respond strategy. So as Spence and John have said, how are we going to detect these things? When they're detected, what are we going to do about it? And then the response itself. One of the really good talking points on the response is this a commercial or a military matter? Particularly in the respect of MANPADs, there's, from the civil perspective, there's very little we're going to be doing about it. So there's going to be a military aspect to this as well. UAV specific mitigation plans, geo awareness, very important. Signage and public reporting. So one of the things that I'm doing with a couple of authorities out in the islands is we're developing QR codes that will go onto weatherproof boards that will go into public viewing areas and potential PLAs around the perimeter fences, so that if somebody does see something they don't like, there's a QR code that they can just look at and go straight to. Spence, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. You said something that I meant to mention earlier on when I was talking about CASA. You just reminded me one of the things that they've introduced on their website is a report unauthorized UAV activity, and aviation enthusiasts, like enthusiasts in many spheres, are a particular group of people. Most of them are very law-abiding people, and if they see somebody that might be putting their hobby or interest at risk, they are going to report it. So spraying that eyes and ears factor, that's a very good point. Thanks for letting me jump in there, Jim.
No worries. Having exercise and preservation of forensics, along with some key performance indicators, will go towards your response planning. So by KPIs, so the detection should be within, it says less than 60 seconds. That would be really nice, but perhaps not quite that sharp, I would guess. Decision within less than 3 minutes, and then a decision to resume operations less than 15 minutes. It describes a monthly dashboard, but that assumes a lot of these sightings per month. So perhaps a major international airport in Australia or New Zealand might go that far. Some quick wins, having a 1-page SOP and a call tree. It's 2 pages of A4. So what are we going to do if we get a detection, what the decision is, and what responses have we got? Briefing landholders around airports. I see that a lot out in the Pacific Islands, where a lot of the land adjacent to the airport is obviously owned by private people. So just email them. We should know who they are, or give them a one-page briefing. And then the best thing, really, because it provides a deterrent value, is to start randomized patrols of PLAs, but on a risk-assessed basis. Obviously, we don't want to be doing them all every day, but let's just start to having a look at so some of the risk-assessed ones that are of a higher risk. And then the final slide is this one. So where ICAO under Annex 17 and that standard requires a MANPADs mitigation plan, we've extended that slightly into a MANPADs and UAV mitigation plan, because they do work well together. And there you see an example content of where certainly together we've made these mitigation plans, we've created them, they've been submitted via a national appropriate authority, and they've gone to ICAO, and they're being very well received. A lot of this has come from the FBI. They provided some of the template, but all we've done really is mix and match to where it's appropriate, certainly in Oceania. Spence, I see your picture up on there. Did you want
My
to
picture is on there, Jim.
It is.
I would just say that when in terms of having a mitigation strategy, the technique that we use at SCG is to, once you've established what all your risks are in a particular threat context, and in this one, clearly we're talking about UAVs, for example, when you've established what all your risk scenarios are, develop a treatment strategy, a way that you can mitigate each of those risks, and have a look at it from a point of view of don't come up with one treatment per risk. Come up with a strategy of treatments, apply them to all your risks, see how many of your risks each treatment will apply to, see how easy it is to actually implement, and how effective that implementation would be. And once you do that, you'll be able to prioritize and work out which of your mitigations are your big ticket items, and then you can work down from there. So that would be my advice when you're coming up with a mitigation strategy against a particular a threat source like UAVs.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for that. So with all of that said and done, we're running a little bit behind schedule. We'd like to invite questions for the panel, or individually by name, as you can see there. Do we have any questions, Katie?
We don't have any. I think super comprehensive information that you guys provided, and just following along felt like quite the tutorial and things that people will need to know, and lots of great information there. So thank you all for such a great input, putting so much effort into the presentation and what's been discussed. I will say we do often get quite a lot of people who watch the recordings of our webinars as well, so not watching the live webinar but watching it at a later date, and you'll see on this slide the guys have kindly included their email addresses. So I would say if there's a question, if you are watching this at a later time in your own time, and you do have a question, that you're welcome to use the contact information provided there.
Okay, thanks for that. Just finally, to close, from all three of us, there is a lot of information out there that's particularly relevant to the region. We've already mentioned document 8973 with its chapters and appendices. The US State Department on its website has some very, very good information as well that will help build a mitigation plan, as does the Australian DFAT website. There's some very good documents on there that are a really viable source for further information. Then, of course, there's the three of us. I'll go back to that one for emails. We're always all available.
Thanks, Jim. If there's no questions, we might wrap it up there. Does anyone have any other final comments to make from the panel?
Not from me.
Nope.
Thanks all for your time.
Thank you for me for the invite, and I would suggest all questions are directed through SafePack as the organizer.
Yeah, great. It has been great having everyone on today, and we're very pleased to obviously present these sorts of very informative webinars in the aviation security stream. And thank you to you all for your valuable inputs today. And we look forward to seeing everybody at our next webinar. Thanks again.
Thanks, Katie.